Well, it is a pleasure to be here today. This is my alma mater, which is an odd thing to say since, as many of you know, I never graduated from a college. As far as I know at the moment, I'm the only president of the 20th century who didn't graduate from a college. But I do have experience, class experience, with the old Kansas City School of Law. I took classes from John B. Gage and Charles Evans Whitaker and a few other folks of that sort. In 1922 and 23, I was in my first elected political office at the time, Eastern Judge of the Jackson County Administrative Court. And it was a great pleasure to have the opportunity to take some courses, but in 1924, you may remember that was not a very good year for Democrats in 1924. Here in Jackson County, among other things, the Ku Klux Klan had reared its head. And they were aligned with the Republicans, and the Republicans were aligned with the Rabbit Democrats under Joe Shannon. And I was aligned with the Goat Democrats under Tom Pendergast. So that was a year that the forces aligned against us, and both my colleague Henry McElroy and I lost. That ended my college days, or my law school days, I should say. But I'm here to be also in the reunion with you because, as a matter of fact, I do have a degree from this institution. That is portrayed in a couple of these photographs here, and I was honored with, I believe it was my first honorary degree once I became president in 1945. I came back to Kansas City and to independence. By the way, I proclaimed that Kansas City is just a part of greater independence while I was here. And this was in late June of 1945. I gave an address at the RLDS auditorium in Independence the day after I arrived, but then that evening came here to the campus, and right outside here gave not really a speech. I think there's a plaque that says it was an address, and that would be an exaggeration as well, but I made some comments and then was awarded the Honorary Doctor of Laws degree, so that I became fully a part of the university, because the law school by that time was a part of the university as well. It, in fact, had been incorporated, one of the key institutions incorporated into the university when it was founded in 1933 and was operating fully at this location at that time. Well, that was a very memorable visit in a variety of ways. It was just 3 months after that April 12th date of 1945. I remember that very well because that morning I had gone to the Senate to open their business. I was the vice president at the time, and the fact was that it was the duty of the vice president to be the president of the Senate, and I went and made sure that the chaplain prayed over them. Lord knows they needed that. And then after a little while, I got one of the junior senators to come forward and sit in the chair. This was the custom of the day. And I went back to my office to meet the customers. That would be folks coming to Washington who wanted to see what a living, breathing vice president looked like. Well, a little later in the afternoon, I had planned to go over to Speaker Sam Rayburn's office. We were going to have a study in probabilities. We were going to have a poker game, is what we were going to have. I got there, and one of his assistants said, "Mr. Vice President, you need to call the White House. Steve Early is after you." So I called, and Steve Early, who was an assistant to the president, said, "Mr. Vice President, you need to get over here right now." So I went back in. I said, "Boys, I don't know what's up, but I have to get to the White House." Got there, and in an unusual situation, they escorted me up to the second floor. In the couple of times, literally, that I had met with President Roosevelt after we had both taken office back in January, It had always been in the area of the Oval Office or the Cabinet room. And so I went upstairs and was shown into a room where Mrs. Roosevelt was located. And she was seated, and I went in and sat down, and she said, "Harry, the president is dead." Just matter of fact. And I responded, I said, "Well, oh, Ms. Roosevelt, I'm so sorry. What can I do for you?" And she said, "No, Harry, what can we do for you? Because you're the one in trouble now." And she was right. Very much so. Well, there were many things to be done. One of the first things that happened, even before we went to Hyde Park to attend the funeral of the president, I was visited in my office by the Secretary of State, Mr. Stimson. And he indicated to me, I'm sorry, that would have been Secretary Stettinius. I apologize. It was Mr. Stimson was the Secretary of War, and he was the key individual on this particular topic. He said, "Mr. President, there's something you need to know about." This was the morning after I had been sworn in the night before. And he brought in some briefing books, basically outlining the Manhattan Project. Now, I had heard through a couple of people before this, when in my capacity as having been a member of the Senate prior to my election and inauguration, I had heard that this project or something like it existed, and I had gone to the same Secretary Stimson asking what was going on. And his comment at the time was, "Senator, you don't need to know." But the morning after I became president, I did need to know. And I sat down, and by the end of the day, I had read through much of the briefing books. And so I was clear that, number one, we did not know for sure whether this would work. But it offered a weapon that might end the war quicker and might save the lives of our soldiers and sailors in the field and on the high seas. And my feeling was anything that would do that would be worthwhile. So I approved the continuation of the Manhattan Project at that particular time. Now, the next thing that had to be decided was, are we going to continue to support the organization, the official organization of the United Nations? Now, we were by that time already fighting the war as the United Nations. That was the name that we as the Allies had taken upon ourselves. But we did not have any organization for after the war. Well, this took no thought at all on my part, because you see, I had fought in the Great War, which after the Second War came along was known as World War I, but as far as those of us that were in it, it was the Great War. And in that situation, at its conclusion, Woody, President Wilson, we used to all call him Woody in our battery anyway, Woody proposed a League of Nations. And I'll tell you, for reasons that I never agreed with, there was an unholy coalition of several Republicans and a few Democrats, including our own Senator James A. Reed of Missouri, who had been a protege, you might say, of the same political organization that I was at one time. And Mr. Reed led the opposition against the League of Nations. I felt we should have joined it at that time, and I felt after as we were trying to conclude the Second World War, that offered maybe the best opportunity to prevent a Third World War. And so I advocated strongly with the Senate and went along with the proposal. And in fact, the reason that I was coming to Kansas City in late June of 1945 is that I had been in San Francisco for the signing of the United Nations Charter at that particular time. Now, after we concluded our business out there, it was late in the evening, and I said, let's fly to Salt Lake City. Nobody understood why. Salt Lake City was in Utah, and Utah had never voted Republican that any of us could remember. But I said, let's go to Salt Lake City. So we did. We arrived there after dark. The next morning we got up and had breakfast, and about 9:30 their time, got on the Sacred Cow and flew to Kansas City. It took us 3.5 hours. So we arrived here. Well, I never get this time change direct, but it was 3.5 hours flight. We arrived here in the early afternoon, but left there at 9:30. And at any rate, it was very striking to me. And so on the evening that I spoke here, which was a couple of nights later, I recalled for everyone and explained why we made that stop in Salt Lake City. You see, my grandfather, Solomon Young, before the Civil War, got a contract to deliver freight from the Missouri River to Salt Lake City. And this was just after the Mormons had set up shop out there. And so he did so. And it took him 3.5 months to get there and 3.5 months to get home after he delivered the freight. Well, it struck me. I didn't know when I said, let's go to Salt Lake City, but that was the reason I went. I wanted to see the city where my grandfather had, in fact, finished that contract and got paid. But it was very striking that when we flew on from Salt Lake City to Kansas City, it took 3.5 hours instead of 3.5 months. And the point that I wanted people to remember that evening is that when I was growing up, our whole world was Jackson County. My father was into politics. He was a road overseer, and everything was tied up with what was going on in the county. And later on, I didn't necessarily follow in his footsteps, although I was a road overseer right after he died, taking his place. But then I was elected as a 2-year Eastern judge for 1 term, and then 2 terms as the presiding judge of the Jackson County Court. And to be honest, my world was Jackson County then. Oh, I knew about the outside world. For example, while I was presiding judge, we had been able to get a bond issue passed. This was in 1931. We called it the 10-year plan here in Kansas City. What it amounted to was we needed to put people back to work. The Great Depression had set in, and the fact was that we needed to put people back to work, and we needed new buildings. Our old courthouse was falling apart, and the City Hall had been there since before the turn of the century. On top of it, we needed a new convention hall, because our convention hall was, well, while it had housed 2 Democratic conventions, it had never been really what it should have been, and we needed something that was really up to snuff for the 1930s. So all that got wrapped into a package supported by Tom Pendergast and City Manager McElroy, and we got it through. The first project was to build a new courthouse in Kansas City. Now, some of you may think that that's a little odd because the Independence is the county seat of Jackson County. But the fact was, more business gets done with the county in Kansas City than in Independence, so we needed a bigger courthouse. And I drove around the country, literally. Got the Dodge out and went from place to place, looking at city halls of good-sized cities. And I found one finally in Shreveport, Louisiana. Now, that's probably not a place that any of us would expect to find something that we really like, but it was a brand new courthouse, smaller than what we were going to need because Shreveport's not as big as Kansas City. But nonetheless, the design I thought was attractive. Ultimately, it's basically the design of the first 5 floors, and then we added the tower on top of it because we needed more space than they did. But I hired the architect as a consulting architect to come to Kansas City. I knew, because if you work in an organization such as Mr. Pendergast operates, you're going to have to work with local contractors and local sources of material supply for concrete and all the materials that go into building a building like that. Of course, he owned most of those companies too, but the fact was that there would be a local architect in charge, but the architect, Mr. Nyhart from Louisiana, could be the consulting architect and really make sure that his design came through. And I'm really very proud of that building. We brought that in under budget, just enough that we could buy a statue of my hero, General Andrew Jackson, President Andrew Jackson. And because Jackson County is named for him, it was most appropriate that we have that statue out there, and that's what we purchased with it and put it out on the north side. I don't know that when they built City Hall across the street, they actually had saved enough money to put in those two little fountains, but nonetheless, there's two fountains with fish mouths in them, and the water comes out of the fish. But that was their decoration, if you will, in front of the City Hall. Later on, people talked about them as cut and lug. Those were critics of the Pendergast organization because they said the only way you got into City Hall is if you paid the lug, and the only way you got a contract is if the organization got a cut out of what you were getting paid. Well, I don't know precisely about all that, although I do know that Mr. Pendergast was in the business of making money, probably most any which way he could. Now, there's another event that takes place on this quadrangle out here that I'm really very proud of. And it was an appearance by the President of Mexico, President Miguel Alemán. And what occasioned that was that this was in 1947. Well, in March of 1947, precisely the time that we were putting together the proposal for what came to be known as the Truman Plan, the Truman Doctrine, which was coming to the aid of Greece and Turkey as Britain was pulling its support out after World War II, and it looked like that the communists and the Soviets were going to try to move in. We needed to do something about that. But I had scheduled a state visit to Mexico. Now that may not sound like much, but the fact of the matter is what I discovered was there had never been an American president visit Mexico on an official state visit. Never happened. We had, of course, fought a war with Mexico in 1848, and I felt that it was time. President Roosevelt had inaugurated things, you might say, with his good neighbor policy, and I thought it was time for us to be neighbors. So I went to Mexico, and President Alemán greeted me, and the crowds were tremendous. Now, the second morning that I was there, we were on a cavalcade to go to the Capitol, where I was going to address the Mexican Congress. And I told them I wanted to make a little detour. I want to go to Chapultepec Castle. I think that's what it is. Anyway, there's a shrine there. And what happened is that in 1848, the forces led by, actually it was 1847, I think, when this happened. I like to read history, and I like to get my history right when I do it. And I believe this was in 1847 that General Winfield Scott was leading American troops in to take Mexico City. And there were a group of cadets from the military academy there in Mexico City who were trying to defend this very important point in the history of the country. And finally, it was going to go, it was very clear that the American forces would overwhelm it. And there were 6 of those young men who chose, instead of surrendering, to jump off the parapet of Chapultepec Castle to their deaths. One of them wrapped in the Mexican flag. Well, I knew that that took a great deal of courage. And I wanted to recognize courage wherever I found it. It didn't matter whether we were in the United States or Mexico. I felt that needed to be recognized. And so I had arranged for a wreath to be in the entourage, and I put a wreath at the marker that was there for those boys. And besides which, I thought a lot more of what they did than what I thought of General Winfield Scott anyway. He was a Whig, and the Whigs became the Republicans, and, you know. Anyway, the fact is that out of that, President Alumni said, I would like to come to the United States. And I said, fine, let's do it this summer. This spring, actually. It wasn't quite summer yet. And so we arranged for him to come to Washington to speak to Congress, as I had spoken to the Mexican Congress. He was the first president of Mexico to come to the United States on an official state visit. And then while he was there, he suggested, he said to me, Mr. President, I would like to go to your hometown and honor you there. And so he flew to Kansas City on his way back to Mexico and came here and spoke the same spot that I had spoken when I received my degree, and spoke of our friendship and what we were going to attempt to be doing in the future to cement that friendship in place. An interesting side story to that I learned later. J.C. Nichols, owned the Country Club Plaza, and they were having their Plaza Fest right about that time. And he apparently got a hold of Mr. Decker, Dr. Decker, the president of the university, and persuaded him that President Alumni should come to the plaza and say some words. Well, so he gathered all the merchants and all the customers that they could find, and they were all waiting in that little plaza between the balcony building and some of the others along there at 47th Street where Wyandotte does its little jog in there. And finally, here came the entourage after President Alumni had given his speech here on campus. And he got out. I saw a picture of this, and J.C. Nichols was there in his sombrero. And I don't know if you can imagine J.C. Nichols in a sombrero, but I'm not sure that this was precisely the kind, because President Alumni was dressed in a business suit, very dapper, good-looking. He was a lawyer in addition to being president. I don't know whether that's a good or bad thing, but nonetheless, since I had a law degree now, I could associate with him. But nonetheless, he was very kind, got out, spoke a few words, and after he left, Mr. Nichols was so happy he put a plaque up at the spot where that particular event had taken place, and I understand it's still there. Well, the point of all of this is that really the point of a university is learning. The point of being a leader is about learning. I feel that I, as president, have to learn every day because there are new situations, there are new things that have happened. As many of you know, I do like to read. And of an evening, I'll frequently, after I've finished the official reading for the day, I'll pick up a history book and read a little bit. And then when I'm about ready to go to sleep, I'll pick up a Zane Grey and kind of top it off that way. My valet at the White House tells me that frequently he'll come in, the light's on, I've got Zane Grey on my chest, and I'm snoring away. So he politely marks my place in the book, places it to the side, turns out the light, and I am none the worse for wear. But the fact is that as it turns out, learning and wanting to learn are extremely important things. And I do believe that universities are the place for that to happen. I think that high schools are the place for that to happen, and for that matter, grade schools. I had very good experience in the Independence grade school and am a graduate of the Independence High School. Wish that we'd have had the money so that I could go to college, but that wasn't to be. So I am most interested in encouraging young people to do that. And at the library that we're building in Independence, we're going to have several rooms where young people can come and learn about the presidency. One thing I want to make clear is that that library is not about me. tell you a story about that kind of illustrates it. As you know, when you walk into the library, there's that big mural that Tom Benton painted. Well, when we were first talking about that, I knew that he was a little, I'd say, antsy in our conversation because I couldn't put my finger on it, but he just seemed a little, I don't know, wondering about the subject matter. But he went ahead and he did his research about independence and the history, the rich history that's there and its impact on the development of the West and other things. And one day, as we were talking about this, I said, Tom, one thing I want you to understand, this is going to be a painting that people will see as they come into the library. Harry Truman is not to be in that painting, because that painting is not about me. That library is not about me. That library is about the presidency. But it's going to be located in Independence. And I think independence is pretty important in the history of the West. And that's what I want you to portray. When he got started on actually painting it, I was there that morning, and he had me get up on a scaffold, and a little bit of that sky up at the top. There's a few brush strokes in there that I actually put on. I can't take any claim for it otherwise, but I put a little blue sky in it. And he finished it up, I think, pretty well. I think he did a nice job with that painting. But you see, that's what it's about, is learning about the institution of the presidency and both how that can be used for good, and we've certainly had examples where it hasn't been used as much for good. So I encourage young people especially to come and use the library as a way to learn so that hopefully we won't make the same mistakes we did in the past. You see, the only history that we're bound to repeat is the history we don't know. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
We have plenty of time, and
well, you always had a birthday party. I remember that your company used to show up and honor you on your birthday in Independence.
Well, that became kind of a tradition, all right. You know what the best birthday present I ever had, though, was? It was the first one I had in the White House, May 8th, 1945. Some people call it VE Day. But the fact is the Germans surrendered. And that was the best birthday present I could have ever had. Bess was back in Independence, and so the staff in the White House baked me a cake. I had a slice, and then I said, why don't you just take this back and all of you have some of that as well? And they said, well, come on. So we all had cake together back in the kitchen. I had a feeling that that hadn't happened in quite a long time, that there'd been a president back in the kitchen. But I enjoyed it very much. And birthdays, sometimes you want to forget them. More and more lately, I want to forget them, I can tell you. But that was a memorable one, and our gatherings after coming back to Independence have been memorable ones as well. So thank you for that memory.
How difficult was it when you actually, I know you said you approved the Manhattan Project, but when it actually came to the time that it had to be implemented, how difficult was that?
Well, I was at Potsdam. I was there when we received word that the experiment in New Mexico had been a success. Now, that was a smaller version of the bomb, but it had worked. It hadn't set the atmosphere on fire, which is what the fear of some folks were. It looked as though it would have an impact. So I signed an order while I was in Potsdam, meeting with Premier Stalin and by that time the new Prime Minister of Great Britain, Clement Atlee, because when we started, it was Prime Minister Churchill, but he lost the election while he was there, and so Atlee took over. He brought Atlee with him, which I guess was, a good idea. Maybe Winston knew that he was going to lose. I don't know. But at any rate, what we did there, I had talked with Winston and with Atlee about it because Great Britain was our partner in the development. There were British scientists at Los Alamos at that time, as well as American scientists, and folks who had gotten out of Germany before Hitler, and all of those folks together were putting it doing the work. But the order came directly from me. In this case, what it amounted to was an order that permitted the use of one nuclear bomb. I did not specify place, time, or target. I simply gave permission for that to be used. And so that was done. What I'm told, the one thing I indicated is I want this used against a military target. Now, what I'm told is that Hiroshima was not actually the primary first choice target for that particular day. But when the planes took off from Tinian Island near Saipan in the South Pacific, which we had been able to get a hold of out of the Battle of Saipan a year earlier, the weather report was that it would be clearest at Hiroshima that morning. So I learned this after the fact. General Groves had the authority to choose the time and the specific target. Now, I've heard people say, well, why did you bomb Hiroshima? That wasn't a military base at all. Well, they forget the fact that Hiroshima was, in fact, the headquarters of the Quartermaster Corps of the entire Japanese Army. And it was a military target. Now, whether it was located downtown or not, that I can't say, but nonetheless, there was a military target at Hiroshima. Now, what happened after that is something that people wonder about. There was a 3-day gap. We were listening intently to see if there was any indication from the Japanese that they would sue for surrender and for terms for surrender. We heard nothing. Officially, unofficially, the Swiss embassy was operating there in Japan as they did as a neutral country, you know, in various areas and such. But there were no messages. Now, we've since learned that, in fact, there was a great deal of crisis in the Japanese government. The government itself officially, the parliament, was under civilian control again. Admiral Tojo had lost his job as the premier or the prime minister as a result of the loss of Saipan, which is kind of interesting, a year before. So he was admiral, and he and the other admirals and generals were greatly resisting the idea of surrender. The parliament was in favor. The emperor did not make a decision as yet. And so I had given the order then for the second bomb to be delivered. Again, not specifying the target. General Groves took that, and as I understand it, Nagasaki, once again, was not the top target that day, but the weather was best. And so on that morning, what was called the boxcar, I took off from Tinian Island, the B-29, and delivered the bomb on Nagasaki. The next day, the emperor sued for terms of surrender. And that was the beginning of the end from that standpoint. Now, one other thing just to keep in mind is that in the interim between Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet Union on August the 8th declared war on Japan. Some people have said, well, that's because they were wanting, you know, to get in onto the act before the very end or whatever. The fact is, believe it or not, they were fulfilling a promise made at Yalta. Stalin said at Yalta that 3 months after the end of the war in Europe, the Soviets had suffered greatly at the hands of Hitler and the Nazi army in World War II in Europe. And this is the reason they had maintained a neutral stance with regard to Japan throughout the war, even though they shared an international border with Japan. But the fact was that they had chosen, they had said that 3 months after the end of the war, which would allow them time to get their troops into position, in fact, to invade then Japanese territory in the Far East, that they would enter the war. Well, VE Day was May 8th. On August the 8th, 3 months to the day, they declare war on Japan, begin to move into the northern part of the Korean Peninsula, among other places. And as a result of that, once the peace terms are finally agreed to, then we request that the Soviet troops in the northern part of Korea stop where they are and not proceed further through the peninsula. And they did. They stopped at about the 38th parallel. I would later understand better the significance of that, but nonetheless, that's what happened. They were actually, in the first place, there because they were fulfilling a promise, and secondly, when we asked them to stop, they did. I wish that they had, lived up to their obligations and commitments a little better later on, but at that particular stage of the game, they were actually doing what they said they would do. Long answer to a short question. I apologize. Are there others that I can be more brief with? Yes.
Did you ever patronize the little drugstore in Inglewood like your wife did and your daughter? My sister used to work there.
Well, that's very good. I have to say that occasionally I would come by. The drugstore that I have most in my mind, of course, is Clinton's down on the square, because I worked there as a young man. Thing I remember most distinctly about that was Sunday morning. In Independence, you could get a drink, at certain times of the week, but certainly not on a Sunday morning, unless you had a prescription for alcohol for medicinal purposes. Well, it seems that the fine worthies, the more wealthy, influential gentlemen of Independence, all had prescriptions. And on Sunday morning, before they would go to church, they would stop by Clinton's so that they could go into the back room where their prescription was kept for them, and they could partake of that prescription before going on to church. Now, all of you know I am not a teetotaler. Our family has always been a little out of step, I suppose, with a lot of things. My mother was a Lightfoot Baptist. You know what a Lightfoot Baptist is, no? A dancing Baptist. She was a very staunch Southern Baptist, and I'm a member of First Baptist Church of Grandview myself, but and I'm a terrible dancer. I will tell you that too. Bess is a good dancer. I'm not a good dancer. But the fact is, Ma enjoyed it. Well, I'm not opposed to people taking a drink. I'm opposed to hypocrisy. These are the same people that would be going to church just shortly thereafter and swearing up and down that they were the pillars of the community and supporting the variety of prohibition laws that were in place at the time when they'd just been violating them. So nonetheless, I wish I could tell you that I had a lot more experience in the Inglewood drugstore. I know the one you mean. I know the one you mean.
You came there.
No, I went, when I got my bourbon, I go very openly to a legal store. And
Well, they had milkshakes, I think.
I'm sure, and I doubt they put bourbon in the milkshakes either.
How about good chili?
I like good chili. What's your favorite, sir?
Well, I'm
Dixons,
curious
okay.
about your experience.
Well, I've had Dixons. I've had other chili. Growing up, that was about the. Even though we were on the farm, we didn't slaughter cows that often, so some of the best meat we had was chili meat, and it was good. I've had a little different cuts, you might say, particularly in the years I was in the White House, but my preference, I suppose, if I was pushed to the wall, it would be to probably Dixons. They've been very loyal there in Independence as well as here in Kansas City. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, sir.
After you retired and the Truman Library was built, there are many stories about you spending at least part of a day, every day, at the Truman Library, looking at your old materials and all. And I know that even in '58, the UMKC History Club went out there and made you a life member of the History and Government Club, which I don't think many people know. It wasn't that important. But what kind of feelings did you have as far as the possession of the materials there at the Truman Library that had been your own personal materials before?
Well, one of the things that I felt was very important was that especially as much of the presidential material as possible could be there, again, because I wanted it to be a place for people to go study the institution of the presidency. Obviously, because I had control of the materials during my term, a good deal of what they're going to be studying is things that would be available to be placed there. But you're talking in terms of why I was there every day. I enjoyed especially school groups coming, and tried as much as possible during the 1950s, once we got it open, to go out and meet every school group that came in. I remember how important it was to me when I saw people like General Pershing. Now, you have to remember that when the Great War was being fought, I was almost 40 years old, so I was a lot older than many of the soldiers. But on the other hand, I was still greatly in awe of people who were capable of doing what I thought were great things. Now, I don't put myself in that category, but I understand that other people see the occupant of the office of president as a person who does great things. I think that office should inspire both confidence and maybe a little bit of awe. Not the person in it, because that's a human being, and that person is going to be as capable of making mistakes or having human frailties as any of us, and I put myself very much in that category. I tried to keep from getting a big head when I was in the White House. Most of the time, I think, succeeded. But the chief point here is I would like young people to be inspired to do great things. And if seeing someone who's been in a position to certainly influence world events as well as national events helps to do that, and seeing them in person, then that's all to the good. And I have to say I don't remember the visit of your club, but I'm very happy that you came, and I appreciate the honor of becoming an honorary member. That's another connection I have to this institution. That's wonderful. Yes, sir.
Early on in your work with the library, we had a large group of registrars and admissions officers, National Convention here. Mm-hmm. And we scheduled a tour out at the library. And I remember we got everybody in, and I checked in with the director, and he said, Mr. Sweeney, we think the president's going to be here this morning. Would you like to have your group meet with him? Oh, I said, sure. He said, well, you need to have to assemble them fast. I said, how about 2 minutes? And we got them assembled. And I'll never forget afterwards, one of my good friends in that association was coming out of the auditorium, and he says, my God, I've been a Republican all my life. I would vote for that guy.
He's seen the light. Well, I'm pleased that you folks came out, and I'm glad that you had such an awakening experience. That's excellent. Yes,
Thank you.
How did you ever get the money out of Congress for the Marshall Plan?
Well, it was like pulling teeth, as you can imagine, in some cases. But the fact is, and especially after that 1946 election, because you know the Republicans had the majority at that point in the Senate and such. But that's the reason why we called it the Marshall Plan and not the Truman Plan. You see, my experience earlier in the year with what was called the Truman Doctrine, and that wasn't my choice to put the name on it, but my experience was that we almost didn't get it through because there were people who were objecting to the fact that my name was attached to it. So when we developed the idea of the Marshall Plan, and it was in fact already being worked out in the State Department and elsewhere in the government, at the time that the Truman Doctrine was put forth. But what I was trying to do there was to give it more prestige by giving it General Marshall's name, as of course he was serving as Secretary of State at that time for me, and I felt he was probably the most widely respected general in the United States, or former general in this case. So having his name on it would give greater credibility. And it seems that that particular strategy worked in that case. As you know, General Marshall is a son of Alabama, was able to bring with him a good deal of support from the Southern senators. I was very fortunate when I was in the Senate because I could relate to people from the South and from the North. Coming from Missouri, I was, could be seen either way. And my own personal experience was that I found good people and some not so good people from both sections. We won't talk about Strom Thurmond, for example. He was a Southerner I didn't particularly care for. But the fact is, Jimmy Burns had been my Secretary of State. 1948, I was about to nominate, 1944, I was about to nominate him for Vice President when I got the phone call from the President saying that I should run. And I had to call Jimmy back and tell him I couldn't nominate him. That was quite an experience. Anything else I could answer for you today?
How did you like farming as a young man and a boy?
Not especially. I will say that you can think a lot about what's happening in the world from sitting in a sulky plow and following the rear end of a mule. But farming was never my special choice in life. I did it for a number of years, both before Daddy died and afterwards, but I really needed to get out of that. And once the war came, I never went back to it.
Were you just as surprised, maybe a lot of the nation was, when you beat Dewey?
Best way to put that is that night of the election, I didn't stay in Independence. In fact, I didn't stay any place where anybody could find me much. I went up to Excelsior Springs, and that's about as far away in time, at least. And I checked in at the Elms. Had one campaign aide with me, and I hoped that what I'd been doing was successful. I had some sense that we were striking a positive chord with the people that we were campaigning with, but it had been a very difficult time. I had 3 opponents. 2 of them were Democrats, because you not only had Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrats, you had the former Secretary of Agriculture, Mr. Wallace, who was, while he was from Iowa, his greatest support was in New York State. And that would take off a lot of the traditional support for a Democratic candidate for president from the North, and obviously Mr. Thurmond was going to do that in the South. And Mr. Dewey was, of course, a New Yorker himself, and might very well take that state. So it was a difficult campaign, and I wasn't entirely sure of the outcome, but I was hopeful. But in case it didn't go well, I wanted to be out of sight. I thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you this morning, and I hope that you have a good time the rest of the day. Thank you.
On anything else, I was going to ask him whether he had ever had a chance to go back and test the theories of probability after he became president. And also look at the pictures.
I'm going to stop being Harry, but on that particular one, what it amounted to, Harry Truman always said that the best way to test another man's character was to play penny-ante poker with him. If he would cheat at penny-ante poker or if he cheated on his wife, either one, you couldn't trust him. And that's probably pretty good advice when you get down to it. Harry did not believe on cheating on his wife. which is obviously something that has been a bit of a problem for some of his successors in office.
How did you live without a pension?
I'm sorry?
How did you live without a pension? You had no pension.
It was the contract to write the memoirs.
Oh.
Yeah. Now, ultimately, the fact is the cost involved in that, because the way the advance came, it also meant that he had to pay a good deal of publication costs out of his advance. And so he didn't ultimately realize a huge amount of money, but he had that money rather quickly after going out of the White House. And so actually he and Bess were fairly comfortable through the first, the early to middle part of the 50s after leaving the White House. And then by the end, I think it's 57 to 58, that in the Eisenhower administration a pension is approved. And so the worst part of that whole piece of legislation from his standpoint is it meant also there would be a Secret Service detail, that would be following him. And he did not. No. When he left office, there was the Secret Service. Once they pulled out of the station in Union Station in Washington D.C. on January 20th of 1953, there's no Secret Service.
There's a book that we had where they left there, and then he and Bess took a car trip back.
Yes.
And they had no.
Yeah, this is a couple of years later.
Yeah, no Secret Service with it, and then nobody knew they were coming, and then every so often.
Harry got a ticket on that trip.
Yeah.
He was on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. He was on the Pennsylvania Turnpike and wasn't used to driving on 4-lane highway. And what happened is he pulled over and cut somebody off, that was, I don't know, they were trying to pass him or whatever, but he got pulled over and got a ticket.
He actually got a ticket. Yeah.
Did he pay for it?
He was stopped. Let's put it that way. Precisely to say that it was a ticket that he wound up paying, I'm not sure that's the case. But because clearly, when the officer stopped him, he had no idea who it was. He figured it out fairly quickly afterwards.
Do you remember the name, what this book is? But it's really interesting because it talks about.
It's something about Harry and Bess take a road trip.
Yeah.
Or something to that effect.
Wonderful trip or excellent trip?
Yes, Harry and Bess's excellent trip.
Yeah,
it was just published about last year.
Yeah, they drove from Independence all the way to Washington, D.C., and nobody knew they were coming, and all of a sudden they'd stop at these places and people would all of a sudden recognize them.
Right.
And it's a very interesting, very fun book where it talks about him driving and how Bess was the coordinator of this trip.
Well, and also very worried because Harry wasn't the best driver.
Right.
He probably hadn't had a lot of
He was out of practice. Now, Harry had done a lot of driving through his Senate years, but while he was in the White House, no, he didn't do a lot of driving at all, obviously. But it is, the interesting thing is, and what we're kind of used to in subsequent times, is that presidents, when they go out of office, generally are fairly wealthy. Sometimes they were wealthy going into office and continue to be coming out. But nonetheless, one way or the other, they tend to come out with a fair amount of money. Now, Harry and Bess were never wealthy, but they were certainly more comfortable because of that book contract and then with the pension. But they were also very, we would almost say ordinary people, which put some people off. I knew people, in my youth who thought, it was just terrible that, that Harry would be as, down to earth as he was, sometimes very earthy in some of his comments. There's the story about, after he'd made one of his talks that the reporters came up to Bess and they said, well, can't you get the president to stop saying manure? Yeah. And she responded, well, you know how long it took me to get him to say manure? And as Harry got older, his tongue got a little looser, as a matter of fact, in retirement. He was a little more frequently willing to let some of that fly.
Oh, there were 2 or 3 experiences I had with Harry. Mm-hmm. One of them was that a Secret Service agent was up in Excelsior Springs with him, okay. After he was
and that would have been true.
And he and the aide and Harry and somebody else sat there and played poker all night.
And then his wife,
Yeah.
the secret agent's wife worked for you.
Oh, yeah, the secret.
But then when you worked at the library.
Oh, and when I worked at the Truman Library, and Ben Zobrist at that time was director, probably some of you remember Ben.
Yeah.
But Ben used to get, the question I asked, Ben used to get very concerned because Harry would go around and pick up things that were his and take them home. And then he'd search all over the place for it. He'd bring it back the next day.
They didn't tell him.
Yeah, but he didn't tell me he was taking them.
Well,
And
from
then
Harry's standpoint, it was his anyway.
That's right. That's why I asked that question.
Yeah.
The other thing that I remember is that I was up there separating some papers for the Weston, for the Jackson County Historical Society, for the Western. Weston. No,
Western.
it was Weston up there. It was a
Weston.
grain
City
mill up
town
there,
Weston, yeah.
and I was separating the papers. And I was walking up the walk, and there's a little old man with a hat on standing up there at the door, waiting to hold the door for me. And as I got closer, I saw it was Harry, and my knees started shaking. And he held the door open for me as I came in. I always thought it was very interesting. Oh, I said, Mr. President. That's about all I said, thanks.
One quick story that Gail and I just learned, and Bill, you may have known this one. We had a guest here, we took on a tour, and the archivist showed something. Truman are so frugal that if somebody gave him, as part of their organization's official stuff, kind of desk calendar, diary, he would use it. And so some of Truman's diary notes are not in the stuff they were spent. There are these books, and the library didn't discover this one until, what, 2002?
2002 or 2003.
2002. And in fact, in it, they discover confirmation in Harry's own handwriting that he offered Eisenhower the nomination in 48.
Yeah.
And they said he was so frugal, he would anything to save
Paper.
a pen.
Yeah, it was like a New
Well,
York
thank you
real
so much.
estate.
Thank you.
Please. Oh, I'm one last plug.
They almost threw it out.
You see that this is part of the Harry S. Truman Center for Government Affairs at UMKC. Truman authorized that in '69. A chancellor in 2006 finally got around to saying, go ahead and try it. But we have a website. Go to the UMKC website where it says Index A to Z. Go to T, click on T, and you'll see a number of things, including a program we had on Harry Truman, the road builder.
Yeah.
Dale, what's his real life?
Do you have a real life? Go ahead, tell them.
I'm a teacher. I teach history. Taught history here at UMKC. I also teach in the Metropolitan Community Colleges, the Blue River branch, which is in Independence. So I teach in Harry's hometown these days.
Nice to see you
Well, thank you.